It's a great pleasure to welcome Lynne to talk to us today. I think she's talked to us on every single festival we've had since about 2004. And Lynne, as you all perhaps know, was head of the Royal School, the Royal Naval School, for many years, and has played a very large part in our community. Very knowledgeable lady, particularly on history, and I'm fascinated to hear the story of the stage. Thank you, Lynne.
Thank you, Hamish, for that, and welcome everyone to this rather unusual gathering, and welcome to anyone on Zoom. I'm particularly glad that Hamish is staying throughout the talk. Usually he pops in at the beginning and the end, and I did say at the beginning I wouldn't do it unless he stayed, and you'll find out why as I proceed. So, welcome to All the World's a Stage, or at least it has been since 1576, and that is the anniversary which I hope to celebrate today. So the subtext is, how did we get from this, the farm cart, to this, which I think is the inside of Drury Lane? So Haslemere loves theatre. How do I know this? Because whenever I go, in normal circumstances, to the theatre in Southampton, in Woking, at the South Bank, the Ivonano, Chichester, especially valuable to our family, and to any of the garden opera establishments around here, we always see people from Haslemere, even people we don't particularly know, but we glimpse in the crowd people who live in this area. And the other very important strand is, of course, Amdram in Haslemere, which is celebrated more widely than you may think. 33 years ago, we lived in Bristol and got the notice that we were going to move to London and to Haslemere. And West Country friends said, that's fantastic, because they do the most amazing pantomimes in Haslemere. And it turned out years before she'd stayed with friends here and been taken to the Thespians pantomime. So Amdram in Haslemere's reputation is bright. I didn't know then that all these years later I would look back and see that at least 3 of my children had spent absolutely ages being in the chorus of the pantomime with the Thespians. And of course the Haslemere players are very famous too, and draw extremely big audiences. And the 2 main venues for performance in Haslemere were in one, and I've certainly sat here as part of a Haslemere audience, and the Haslemere Hall, which is the most fantastic resource, as well as various outdoor spaces and spaces in schools and private houses, all of which have been used for performance in the time that I have lived in Haslemere. So the question is, how did it happen? How did we get from the back of the farm cart? Where did it come from, and why do we have such a rich and diverse theatrical culture in England? And there are many threads to untangle. I'm just going to follow 1.5. But we need to get a picture from the various sources about how our culture developed. So we all know the story about this place, don't we? The remains of the Roman theatre at Verulamium, a popular spot for school trips, certainly ever since I was a child. And there, I don't know what the performance is, but a modern company performing there. Now, I was always taught that the stones were looted because the Romans left us in 410. The stones were looted and taken away. We would now say they were recycled, wouldn't we? They were repurposed and made very good use of for agricultural purposes. But as far as we know, all of the skills and talents around theatre went with them. We do not have, there may be yet to be discovered, but we do not have a link that connects those Roman theatricals with what came later. It lay dormant. Now, the next digression. When I was a child, my mother told me that she went to church 3 times every Sunday. And my brothers and I thought this was rather odd because my parents didn't show any sign of religious mania in their mature years. She lived in a farmhouse quite out of a village with no electricity and no running water. And eventually I realized, of course, church going was the social event of the week. And in churches, there is music, there is an organ, there may be a choir, there is colour, there are stained glass windows, there are vestments. And also there is the highly symbolic ritual of the elevation of the host in the Mass, which has a very powerful dramatic effect. So I think looking back, we can see that even recently as the 1930s, that church going was social and entertaining as well as spiritual. So it may not surprise us to learn that the origin of theatrical performance in England has two main sources. One began in the liturgy of the church, and the other arose out of what we might call communal high spirits and the desire for fun and satire and entertainment. So we know that for our forebears, their leisure time was associated around religious festivals. In fact, throughout the Middle Ages, there were lots of days off because many saints' days meant a day off. And all sorts of festivities clustered around that. For example, there was Hock Monday, now known as Easter Bank Holiday, and Hock Tuesday. And the game on those days was for all the young women in the village or the town or whatever to capture the men and tie them up. It would now be frowned upon, I'm sure. You'd attach them to a tree or sort of put them in a box and sit on it, and they had to pay money to get out. And this was ostensibly to raise funds for the parish, and I'm sure it did, but I think it may have served other purposes as well. So what I'm going to try to talk about is how the art of performance developed from its origins in church liturgy into the wide-ranging theatrical culture which we enjoy. This is a church. This is a nice church, and you can imagine the audience, congregation, enjoying the music and the light and the colour. So there's a parallel thread which developed at the same time in aristocratic circles. From the 11th century onwards, greater political stability throughout Europe and Britain led to the development of a court culture, and fewer fights and battles meant more parties, and court culture for entertainment could develop, and women began to play a bigger part in what you might call the court. Up till then, it was very separate. Fighting men and leaders led a very separate life. But as a by-the-by, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was key to this because she liked music and entertainment. And of course, she was a very powerful political figure. So we may have to thank her for part of that development. But mummings and disguisings and masks of all kinds began to develop very slowly in that aristocratic setting. And by the high Middle Ages, royal actors joined some professionals in celebrating events and also showing off their elegance, their dancing, their music. And Henry VIII is a good example. He took part in all this sort of thing with great gusto. And on the morning of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he and some of his chums dressed up as Robin Hood and his merry men and surprised her. I'm not sure, speaking from her point of view, if I would have been that delighted, but they surprised her first thing in the morning while she was still in bed and sort of danced around the room and generally made merry. And that kind of thing was very popular in aristocratic circles. So in looking at the different contexts in which theatre developed, I'm going to begin with what is described as the first known theatrical performance in England. And it took place in Winchester Cathedral in the year 965. And the saintly Bishop Athelwold carried out a tidying up exercise in order to create some conformity in his liturgy. And he introduced new regulations, Regularis Concordia, and it had a special section for Easter, Visitatio Sepulchri. And the instructions were for some clergymen, one to play the part of the angel at Christ's tomb, and 3 others to be the grieving women approaching. And he asks in Latin, "Whom seek ye?" And they reply, "We come to seek the Lord." And he replies, "He is not here, he is risen." It may well have been sung, and it may well have been going on for a long time before that date, but this is the first date at which we know for sure it happened. And there were also instructions for what we would call costumes and props, special copes for the angel, and the grieving women carried a thurible to represent the vessels with the ointment that the women were carrying. So the didactic purpose is clear. The audience was required to believe in Orthodox Christianity in order to be saved from the fires of hell. The Bible and the services were all in Latin, and very few people could read at all. Only the clergy could read Latin. And in fact, the poor standard of clergy Latin was a real beef of the bishops throughout the period. So not even all the clergy were good Latinists. So that the dramatic presentation was designed to help the ordinary laity achieve the salvation of their souls, but it was still in Latin. But perhaps they got the idea. It gives us a starting point. And also, just interestingly, that thread in drama of didactic writing and the educational purposes of writing is still very strong today, isn't it? Agitprop theatre is very popular, particularly in university towns. And David Hare constantly writes plays about topical political issues. The recent series on TV, Small Axe by Steve McQueen, focusing on race issues. And I'm sure some of you saw It's a Sin, the series focusing on the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, which was very popular just before Christmas. So this didactic approach to writing drama is alive and kicking. And of course, The Archers was originally devised to impart agricultural information to the rest of us. I don't know why it was thought we needed it, but that too is still going strong. So all was mostly well, as long as the dramatized extracts remained brief and acted by junior clergy under the firm control of the bishops. But we can imagine the reaction of the congregation, who may have understood for the first time the meaning of the resurrection. Its entertainment value, I'm sure, helped that understanding and cheered them all up. But objections very quickly were raised because the bishops were very worried about the prospect of a clergyman impersonating God in the person of Christ and felt that this would be blasphemous. So the actual scenes enacted during the Mass were discouraged. And the religious plays gradually leaked out of the churches and cathedrals, and therefore greater innovation became popular. So any dramatic performance draws on a wide range of skills. The audience sees actors and applauds them. I think in my entire life, I've only seen the set applauded once, and I can't even remember what it was, but as the curtain opened, it was stunning, and the audience spontaneously applauded that. But it's a pity, because without the set designers and builders, painters, costume makers, wig makers, armor specialists, fight directors, money men, box office, and lighting, video, and electricians, there would be no show. Modern theatre did not spring up only out of the talents of actors and playwrights. It needed teams of gifted and experienced specialists before it could evolve from the enactment of biblical scenes in a church service to filling a theatre like Shakespeare's Globe, which could seat 3,000 people. So you may be surprised to know that the key players in the evolution were actually, it was the Pope, two popes in fact. In another attempt to teach the illiterate masses the importance of the Mass, in 1264, Pope Urban IV introduced the feast of Corpus Christi, a celebration of the body of Christ in the communion host. And the feast was held on the first Thursday after Trinity Sunday, which means sometime in late May to mid-June. And the date turns out to be another unexpected but important part of the picture. In 1311, Clement V made the feast obligatory and stipulated that it was to include a procession of the host around the church and outside it. And from 1318, the feast became obligatory in England. And given the summer date and the well-established taste for fun and hijinks, it's not surprising that the processions attracted public support and that elaborated versions of some of the religious plays developed. So in any community, there are movers and shakers, individuals who take on hours of unrewarded labor in order to create public events. And if that were not so, we would not have the Haslemere Festival. And I'm looking at Hamish, our chairman, here as I say this. In medieval towns, the lay civic leaders were the guildsmen. The guilds were a combination of a trade body and a religious club. Typically, they were led by elected officials and had responsibility for training apprentices and maintaining standards in their trade. They were the forerunners of the livery companies of today. Many of them evolved out of and combined the functions of religious fraternities. These were common throughout the country, attached to a parish church or a cathedral, and formed in honor of a saint. Membership was open on payment of a fee to both men and women. They took part in services, feasts, and the election of their officers. Importantly, they provided limited insurance services for widows and orphans and prayers for departed members. They organised funerals and kept registers of the departed so that they could be prayed for at regular intervals. And this was supremely important in a culture that believed that the souls of the dead resided in purgatory, just like hell, but temporary. Any individual sojourn could last thousands of years, and exit depended on the expiation of the sins committed on earth. The surest route was through the prayers of those left behind. The doctrine of purgatory is a big subject, but here we just need to note that the guilds had a great appeal, and you can see why, can't you? It guaranteed that your successors in your guild would go on praying for your soul and getting you nearer to the exit from purgatory in perpetuity. They didn't imagine that the system would come to an end. And it had great support from the general population, and it attracted the most energetic members of society. They combined religious, political, and commercial motives, and their members wanted to achieve power and prestige in their communities, increase their trade, and get into heaven. And so it was that in the hands of the guilds, the processions became more complex. They took it over from the church authorities and began to develop it. Short biblical scenes were performed on the back of farm carts, and that's, by the way, where the farm cart comes in, you may have been wondering. And they were pulled along so that they could be seen from various standpoints in the town. And I'd love to know who wrote the scripts, but alas, we did not. The remaining scripts of what came to be known as the mystery plays are full of vitality and imagination. The religious stories became fused with local culture, and for more than 200 years, they were, in some towns, the centerpiece of communal life, and they were finally destroyed by the Reformation. They lasted, I think, in York or maybe Coventry till about 1570 something, before finally fading away. There's evidence of performance from many parts of the country, including a collection in Cornish, in Cornwall. Now, I'm going to apologize for this. This is not a great photograph, but it was the best I could do on my phone last week. Just had a few days away in Cornwall at St. Just, at the very tip, and was very surprised to find that I was immediately next to one of the only two Cornish playing places. So I think you can see the bank. It's a complete flat circle. It's probably about the size of 3 or 4 tennis courts. And under the grass bank are stones, so that the original audience would have sat there on stones. And you can see that around it, modern building, the modern world has developed. But fortunately, in St. Just in Penwith, that space remains for us to see. And in York, the best known texts and the best known cycles are from York, Wakefield, Chester, and Coventry. And in York, the plays were performed over 2 days. They had 48 carts, and they were moved around the town so that with patience, an individual could see the whole history of mankind from the creation to the day of judgment from one spot. And the religious theme was generously augmented with additional interpretations, often comic and sometimes ribald. Now, in the Bible, this is Hamish's big moment, in the Bible, we are told that Noah built the ark and that his wife very helpfully accompanied him. No, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about, yes, Hamish. In the Bible, we are told that when Joseph heard that his fiancée was pregnant, he had a mild moment of concern, and the angel then reassured him that all was well and he could go ahead and marry his fiancée. The trope of the foolish old man who marries the younger woman who wants to exploit him is everlasting. It was certainly strong when the Coventry playwright wrote this scene.
For shame, let be. Ye be with child so wondrous great. Ye need no more thereof to treat against all right. Forsooth, this child dame is not mine. Alas, that ever with mine eye I should see this sight. Tell me, woman, whose is this child? Husband in faith, and that a cold. Ah, well away, Joseph, as thou art old, like a fool, now may I stand and trust. But in faith, Mary, thou art in sin, so much as I have cherished thee, dame, and all my kin, behind my back to serve me thus. All old men example take by me, how I am beguiled here, may you see, to wed so young a child.
Thank you. So you can see that there's a great deal of addition to that, and I'm quite sure that when it was performed with enormous gusto and a great satirical power. I will now give you my sub-Coronation Street version of Noah's wife, who in the Bible helpfully gets onto the ark and looks after the animals. Just one word of explanation. She refers to her gossips. Gossips is an amalgamation of god siblings, and in the Middle Ages, it meant basically your friends. People lived in static communities, and their parents would have chosen for them godparents from their community, as they would have chosen from among that group to be godparents to their own children. Gossip now has an unpleasant connotation, but at this time it simply meant your friends. And she's a drunkard, and in performances she's usually staggering about. And she says, "Yea, sir, set up your sail, and row forth with evil hail. For without any fail I will not out of this town, but I have my gossips every one. 1 foot further I will not gone. They shall not drown by St. John, and I may save their life. They love me full well by Christ. But thou wilt let them in thy chest, else row forth, Noah, whither thou list, and get thee a new wife." And that scene ends with her clocking him round the ear. So I hope that gives you a taste of what normal people did with Bible stories to make them entertaining and to liven them up. Now the carts themselves became increasingly fancy. So the one on the left is obviously a basic farm cart. It's a replica, and it has woven sides. I think more typically it would have had solid wooden sides. But if you look at this, which is an illustration from performances in Middle Europe, you can see that the cart has become a moving theatre. With the help of drapes and flats and scenery built to move on it, a very much more glamorous performance is possible. And the very earliest professional players were the troops who took their farm carts on the road, performing in village greens and in courtyards. And their fortunes varied, sometimes protected by a powerful patron they could flourish, but often they had a hard time, persecuted by local authorities keen to preserve law and order. In fact, the perception of actors spreading moral contagion was widespread. They were on the road, which meant that they were outside established social structures and therefore dangerous in themselves. They gathered a crowd, which was not easy to control, and they were a magnet for prostitutes. A large crowd could easily become a public menace. And in fact, the first ever record of drama in London comes from a complaint made by the prioress of St. Mary's, Clerkenwell. I don't know if any of you know this building in Clerkenwell, Well Court. Some of you may have worked near there. This is a well house, and the entrance shelters the remains of the clerk's well. And in fact, there was an entrance, if you go into the hall on the left, you can see it, it's in a glass enclosure, and it had steps down one side for the population, anyone who needed water, and the wall for the priory went up between so that the nuns could collect their water without being seen by others. But in 1300, the ground there was gently rising in a semicircular shape, and it was a natural auditorium, and it became famous for performances of all kinds. We know that Richard II attended performances there, Henry's IV and V, and that the performances were, I suppose you might say, a variety show, music, acrobatics, religious extracts. Wrestling was incredibly popular, and bishops and princes had their own wrestlers who they would put out to entertain the crowd. However, in 1300, the prioress, a woman after my own heart, was very concerned because the crowd was trampling down her corn. And that is the very first documented reference we have to a performance in London. So Shakespeare paints an affectionate picture of the actors in Hamlet's conversation with the player king. It seems clear that he was familiar with the exaggerated style popular in both of the travelling troupes and the mystery plays. In fact, one of the theories about his so-called lost years, which is most of his 20s, is that he was a member of a travelling troupe himself. it's almost certain that he saw troops performing in Stratford-on-Avon during his childhood. And the town of Coventry insists that they're quite certain that as a child he was taken there. It's 20 miles apparently to see the mystery plays, the Corpus Christi plays there. At any event, he had plenty of time to observe and disapprove of the histrionic style popular with 16th century audiences, and he attempts to tone down the hammy style associated with those plays. And here we have an actor from the Royal School.
Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. But if you mouth it, as many of your players do, I had as lief the town crier spoke my lines. Nor do not saw the air too much with your hands thus, but use it all gently, for in the very torrent, tempest, and, as I may say, the whirlwind of passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. Oh, it offends me to the soul to hear a robustious, periwig-pated fellow tear a passion to tatters, to very rags, to split the ears of the groundlings who, for the most part, are capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and noise. I would have such a fellow whipped for overdoing termagant. It out Herod's Herod. Pray you avoid it. Be not too tame neither, but let your own discretion be your tutor. Suit the action to the word to the action. For this special overstep, not the modesty of nature, anything so overdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end both at the first and now was and is to hold as 'twere a mirror up to nature.
Remember how he's telling the actor not to saw the air or out Herod, because Herod was one of the most hammily acted roles in all of the mystery plays. They used to go really bonkers, striding up and down, threatening, foaming at the mouth. So he's saying, don't do that, but hold the mirror up to nature. Because what he wanted was a more naturalistic style. Yes, I'm sorry about our young actor who very gamely in the middle of his A-levels volunteered to record that, so thank you, Ben. There are two remaining inns also which give us a sense of what the performance conditions were like in the inns. This one I think is the George at Southwark. That's one of the inns. There are two remaining, the George at Hintonampner and the George at Southwark. Now you can see that the one at Hintonampner actually is in a horseshoe shape, and the access to the rooms was through the walkway on the outside. And the players would come in and plonk their cart, perhaps we should now call it a stage, in a space where the people on the galleries could look down and see them, and others could stand in the courtyard. And if you're familiar with the layout of the Globe, which I'm sure many of you are, you can see how that eventually translated into the first built theatres. And this is a cut through of the Globe, and you can see the apron stage thrust forward, so that the actors are very much a part of the action and very close to the audience. And the drawing on the left, it was made by a Dutchman who visited London in the late 16th century called De Witt. And he just did that little sketch where you can see the precursor of Shakespeare's Globe. And you can see, I think, the connection to the inns where those actors would have been experienced in performing. So the tension between the nature and value of theatre is seen in the last strand that I'll discuss today. Throughout the Middle Ages, the streets of London were the location for pageants and processions which celebrated the arrival of royal brides, for coronations and funerals, the annual Lord Mayor's procession, and conquering heroes returning from France. And all of these occasions had the enthusiastic support of both the court and the same city which tried very hard always to close down the professional theatres, nonetheless benefited very significantly from these public events. Arrivals were greeted by singers and actors placed in elaborate sets and gloriously costumed. And typically they had a didactic message. For example, Margaret of Anjou arriving was treated to a number of pageants which reiterated her function, which was she had to have a baby and give an heir to Henry VI as quickly as possible. And that must have rankled in the 9 childless years that followed. There was only one bridge across the Thames, and visitors and conquering heroes all followed the same route and were greeted by a display of theatrical feats. Henry V's return after Agincourt saw the conduit in Cheapside flowing with red wine rather than water. And Henry himself, I think, showed promise in the theatrical area. Normally, the king would come back across the bridge wearing his best kit, crown on helm, on a big horse, tastefully showing off any wounds he'd acquired, and everyone would go, ooh, ah. Henry walked across London Bridge wearing a pair of old breeches and a white shirt. What a professional, don't you think? Absolutely brilliant crowd manipulation, showing his humble service to his people. I don't think it's a coincidence that he was very keen on the theatre. He was a regular attender at the Clerk's Well, for example. So there was no criticism of the extravagance from the city authorities. These civic events cemented the social cohesion of the city, and they displayed the magnificence of court and city and conveyed clear messages about their expectations of the population and the arriving celebrities, whoever that may have been. Hundreds of actors, singers and artisans were required, and some of the scripts survive, some written by well-known poets, for example, John Lydgate. And it seems that the performers were a mixture of amateur and professionals, but there was nothing amateur about the event. There was strong support from all sections of society, with the exception perhaps for the entry of Queen Anne Boleyn, which was apparently poorly attended and the crowd was unenthusiastic. However, opposition to public theatres remained strong. The Puritan faction on the City of London Council did its best to close them down. Outbreaks of plague periodically gave them a legitimate reason, but their persistent campaign was against the corruption spread by the actors, who were regarded as little better than vagabonds. And in addition, the gatherings of unsupervised youth resulted in jollity of an unpuritanical type. By the early 16th century, there was a well-established theatrical culture, both religious and secular. There was a pool of performers and artisans ready and waiting. Frustratingly, we do not have the text of the Corpus Christi play in London. We know that the Skinners Company took a leading part in organising. We know that at the parish of All Hallows on the Wall had a major season from April to Michaelmas 1526. The churchwarden's accounts tell us how much they paid the landowner for the timber, for the carter to transport it, for the carpenter to build a substantial auditorium. We even know the size of the takings, but we do not know the text. And I will say, just for a moment, what a useful source churchwardens' accounts are. I actually find it very moving to sit reading the handwriting of an ordinary Londoner from the 15th century who's just keeping the accounts straight to make sure that they know how much money they've spent. As regards the theatrics, I mean, we know, for example, that the parish of St Giles became a specialist in renting out costumes and scenery. They must have had real enthusiasts there. And those who've lived in Haslemere for quite some time may share my pleasure in reading in the accounts of St Margaret's Westminster that Mistress Ford was paid 5d for the thread to make the dragon for the George play. So I've often wondered if there's any connection with the well-known Ford family in Haslemere. So clearly there was talent and enthusiasm and experience, but something more was needed to synthesize the strength of the amateur practitioners and the vaguely disreputable professionals. And in the career of two Londoners, we see the bridge that led to a recognizable professional theatre. John Rastall was a writer and publisher whose interest in theatre may have been inspired by seeing Henry VII and his Queen at the Coventry Mysteries when he was a boy in the late 15th century. And as a Middle Temple lawyer, he would have known Thomas More, a noted amateur actor. His career in the civil service took him into France in 1520 as clerk of the King's Works. He was responsible for the extraordinary tents, it's the wrong word, but I don't know another, that Henry took with him to entertain and impress the King of France. And those are the tents. And they're actually made like theatrical flats. They are made on a big frame, with lots of decoration and painting, allegorical paintings giving the history of the English king and his exploits, and on a very big scale. And he continued to publish plays in London, and in 1524, he built a theatre in his garden in Finsbury Fields, not yet a public theatre, but a theatre in which plays could be performed. At the same time, Richard Gibson, yeoman of the King's Tents and deputy master of the King's Revels, was producing court entertainments, including the disguising where Henry VIII dressed up as Robin Hood. And the next part is important. When not required for royal duties, Gibson became what we would call a freelance producer. We know that he was employed in this role by large parishes in the south of England, for example, Lydd in Kent, to produce their parish plays. So sometime in the 1520s, Rastell and Gibson linked the prestigious secular theatrics of the royal court with the theatre of the people. They used scenery on a big scale, scriptwriters from London, some of them famous, and in Finsbury, Rastell created a permanent private playing space, essential if playgoing was to develop. So now we come to 1576, the anniversary year. 445 years ago, James Burbage, an entrepreneur, member of the Carpenters' Company, man of some wealth and a bit of an amateur actor, built and ran the theatre in Shoreditch. It's on the 55 bus route from Waterloo to Bethnal Green, and it's just off Curtain Road. You pass it on the right as you're going out. And he took the financial risk involved in building a large-scale, permanent public theatre. He must have been confident that not only could he source actors and play scripts, but all the other specialists needed too. He was on surer ground than he knew. His son Richard became the greatest tragic actor of his age, taking all the major parts in Shakespeare's plays. The young playwright, Shakespeare, who they employed, became the greatest playwright the world has ever known. And they also Ben Jonson and Marlowe worked for them. The company marked a turning point. It combined theatrical skills developed through centuries of parish and civic plays and pageants with financial and entrepreneurial skills and the creative genius of Shakespeare, Marlowe and Jonson. But tenancy of the theatre was problematic. They rented the ground from a landlord. They built and paid for the theatre. They felt they owned the theatre. When the lease came up for sale, their landlord decided that theatre was his and he didn't wish to renew the lease. Now, here it gets very silly. The story, which I have read in a number of learned volumes, is that they waited for him to go away from London, that they dismantled the theatre overnight and moved it to the site they had bought south of the river and rebuilt it as the Globe. Now, if you know that area, I've looked at maps to see if any of what are now underground rivers flow anywhere near where they could float timbers down. No. It's a very long walk, even in this day and age, on paved roads to get from up there in Shoreditch down to the South Bank. I have no idea how they removed that theatre, but I would seriously like to know. So many of you will have visited the new Globe on the South Bank near its original site, and we can still sense the tradition of the travelling players performing in the yard. The apron stage brings the performers close to the audience, and there is both bawdy humour and high-flown rhetoric. The groundlings are packed shoulder to shoulder, and the better off can observe in comfort. However, the developments that a purpose-built theatre made on what was possible for the amateurs performing their parish plays and the travelling professionals is obvious. There are sophisticated special effects. Goddesses can be flown down from above, ghosts can rise from below, and musicians can play at the back of the gallery. And there is a permanent tiring house for costumes and props behind, so you're not constantly having to protect things from rain and damage. The plays began at 2 o'clock. There's no stage lighting yet, and the wherry boatmen on the Thames did a really good trade ferrying people across. A number of Londoners' journals of the period tell us just how popular the theatre had become, and they're evidence of the last piece of the jigsaw, the last vital ingredient in the creation of a thriving theatrical culture, a regular and loyal audience. The fate of the Globe, the original Globe, is well known. The theatre lasted only a short while. Built in 1599, it burnt down in 1613. The fire caused by special effect in a performance of Henry VIII. They fired a cannon, not with a real ball, but it had some accelerant on the powder, or on the cloth that they fired, and it stuck in the straw thatched roof, and the place burnt down. It was rebuilt, and this time with a tiled roof. The company was renamed the King's Men on the accession of James I, and they expanded their operations to an indoor theatre at Blackfriars. At this point, the theatre becomes less democratic. Ticket prices at Blackfriars were more expensive, and they were aimed at a more elite audience. Other companies were performing and building theatres on the South Bank and performing in spaces within the city. And their efforts were regularly interrupted by the repression of city authorities and the plague. Nonetheless, the Globe flourished until 1642, when the Puritan Commonwealth finally achieved the ambition of generations of killjoys by closing all of the theatres. That's supposed to be Shakespeare and his chums. I don't believe it myself. Now here we have Charles II and his friend Noel Gwynn. He returned in 1660, bringing with him a decidedly un-Puritan way of life, including a love of theatre. And during his reign, there was a flowering of restoration drama. New indoor theatres were built, that is Drury Lane, which many of you will have attended. The apron stage disappeared because, and the proscenium arch dominated, aided by the development of some indoor lighting, and women were allowed to act. Theatre going once again became highly fashionable, encouraged by the example of the Merry Monarch. So modern London has some of the most famous theatres dating from the 18th century, for example, the Haymarket. Many date from the late 19th and earlier 20th centuries, and that accounts for the ornate decoration and the queues for the ladies' loos. And some were obviously built on sites that were actually too narrow. And if you've ever sat in the gallery looking down the hair parting of the actors, I think at the Duchess, and some of those other West End theatres, you will know what I mean. Within living memory, we have gained the National Theatre on the South Bank, and of real local interest, the Chichester Festival Theatre. And the rebuilding of the Globe in the late 20th century has brought the process full circle back to its 16th century origins. So since Cromwell closed the theatres, they have only been closed on two other occasions. One was World War II, and the one we know about, sadly now, the pandemic. In good times and in bad, human beings, including those who live in Haslemere, flock to the theatres to see, to be entertained, enlightened, disturbed, distressed, moved, delighted. In short, to have the mirror held up to their nature. This last year has helped us to appreciate more than ever the essential value of live theatre and how much we miss it when all the world is no longer a stage. That's it, thank you.
Who's got some questions for the...
Very interesting. Thank you, Eliza. I wonder whether there were such periods as this pandemic when theatres had to close. I don't know about the exact dates, but things like the play was a theatre public space at that time, and they had to close theatres down.
Yes, it was a regular event, we know, in London. Sorry.
Repeating the question.
Oh, sorry. Yes, the question is, did theatres have to close in the past because of things like the pandemic, for example, the plague? The answer is yes, it was a regular occurrence. Apparently Shakespeare wrote King Lear while he was probably at home in Stratford, out of the way of an outbreak of plague. So yes, it was a regular problem, along with all the other problems of producing plays.
I'm struggling here with my internet connection just gone down, so we had questions a moment ago. Yes, Robert, you asked a question.
Very prosaic question, but how was the time communicated to the great mass?
Sorry?
How was the time of the commencement of the performance?
Flag went up. The flag went up. They had a flagpole at the Globe, and they raised the flag when the performance was going to start. It was always known to be on at 2 o'clock, but if the flag going up let them know that the weather was fine and that everything was in order for a performance.
And I suppose if you weren't in sight of the place, you would be able to get there anyway.
Well, anywhere in the City of London, you'd probably have been within sight because it was such a small place. And also, local businesses, as now, really depended on it. The Wherryman absolutely flourished. was something like a penny across, and it did stimulate the economy.
This is not a question, it's just a statement. When I was a student at university, I was in that religious convention, the 5 plays about Mary by another hand.
Yes.
We performed it in the university church.
Yes, well, it is still popular with students, bits of the mystery plays. Sorry, sorry, a lady in the audience was commenting that she had taken part in one of the Commentary Mary plays whilst a university student. It is still popular, it's part of the university drama department curriculum, but also the mystery plays from the creation of the world to the Day of Judgment were performed at the Royal School to celebrate the millennium in the year 2000, and God was played by Hamish Donaldson.
Who else?
Yes, exactly. Yes, I remember we had a lovely performance of Noah's Ark with every child in the junior school in it, including nursery children being little animals. And they built an ark on the terrace at the back. You see, every generation and every location recreates those stories according to its tastes and its interests. And I hope that that came out with the 2 extracts that we played. They were meant to entertain you and just to show how local humour trumps devoted scripture analysis.
Hamish, can I just mention a couple of things before we continue? First is, I'm sorry we weren't able to hear the sound of your act. We will be sending out a recording of this, as you know, and we will aim to include that performance in that recording. And the second thing, if you'll forgive me, as you mentioned Nell Gwynn, just to let you know that the Haslemere Festival will be performing a play about the life of Nell Gwynn, so continuing the theme at the end of September, and you would all be very welcome to come. It includes songs and ribald humour.
Yes, we would.
Thank you.
Just adjusting the thing. Thank you so much, Lynne, for that gallop through history of the theatre. It's extraordinary how it's developed. And of course, once you've explained it, it becomes so natural. You will observe that I had to be a Coventry local, which is why I've taken my jacket and tie off, to be in the spirit of the mystery play. And of course, so Lynne has got great powers of persuasion. Can I thank you so much for a most entertaining and instructive talk. It's been very entertaining. Thank you, Lynne.